World War II was perhaps the most brutal and terrifying conflict in human history. This 6-year war is remembered for countless significant events, from the Nazi massacres of the Jewish people to the atrocities committed by Imperial Japan, the massive Allied campaigns, and the fierce battles that caused millions of casualties. Among the most well-known events were undoubtedly the 2 atomic bombings carried out by the United States on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, which were the first and only times atomic bombs were used in warfare. Their consequences were horrific and have haunted generations of humanity. By 1945, the Second World War was nearing its end. Allied forces launched numerous campaigns on both the Western and Eastern fronts in Europe, pushing back the Axis powers. On May 8, 1945, after the fall of Berlin and Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender, the war in Europe ended. However, in the Pacific Theater, fierce fighting continued between the Allies and the Japanese Empire. Japan was increasingly on the losing side, especially after the defeats at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the relentless bombing campaigns against Japanese cities. The possibility of ending the war in 1945 was entirely foreseeable, yet Japan still had no intention of surrendering. Despite growing civilian casualties and destruction from bombings, with 66 cities bombed and around 1.7 million people losing their homes and hundreds of thousands killed or wounded, particularly in the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945, which alone claimed at least 100,000 lives, Japan's leadership remained defiant. Just 2 days after the Tokyo bombing, Foreign Minister Shidehara Kijuro expressed a widely shared view among top government officials that the people would gradually adapt to daily bombings and their unity and resolve would only grow stronger. But the reality was undeniable. Japan's military could no longer withstand the pressure from the Allies, especially the United States. Japan's main offensive forces in the Pacific, its Navy and Air Force, were nearly annihilated. Its industrial base was devastated, and the homeland was tightly blockaded. Lacking sufficient weapons to resist, Japanese commanders resorted to their last advantage, samurai spirit and the willingness to die for the emperor. Early 1945 combat showed that kamikaze suicide attacks were effective weapons, despite the loss of over 3,900 pilots and aircraft, as they inflicted significant damage on the Allied Navy. By July 1945, Japan still had 12,725 aircraft, nearly all of which were designated for suicide missions. Japan's military even drafted a plan for a national resistance campaign involving the entire population. Besides kamikaze planes, Japan possessed various other suicide weapons for sea and land combat. They planned to deploy 53 divisions and 25 independent brigades, totaling 2.35 million troops to fight the Allies, with an additional 1.25 million Navy personnel fighting on land due to the lack of warships. Furthermore, they mobilized all men, aged 15 to 60, and women aged 17 to 45, totaling 28 million people, to be armed with any available weapons from rifles to bows and swords. There were also 4 million defense industry workers who were organized into independent combat units, combining production and combat roles. In addition, the Japanese armed forces still had 3 million troops stationed abroad. Apart from remote areas like New Guinea, the Indonesian archipelago and Indochina, Japanese forces were heavily concentrated in mainland China, especially in Manchuria and Korea. The spearhead of the 6 Japanese armies was the Kwantung Army with a strength of nearly 1 million troops. According to the summer 1945 operational plan, if the homeland were to fall, the troops would retreat to Manchuria and continue resisting to the end. The Japanese government decided to fight to the last man, believing that the Americans would eventually give up if the casualties from attacking Japanese soil became too heavy. American public opinion would then force the government to negotiate, allowing Japan to propose favorable armistice terms. On the Allied side, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted to President Truman an attack plan on Japan called Operation Downfall. The plan was divided into 2 phases, Operation Olympic and Operation Coronet, both beginning with long-term carpet bombing missions from planes based in China and Korea. The United States expected to lose at least 100,000 troops in Operation Olympic and 250,000 in Operation Coronet. However, the successful test of the first atomic bomb named Trinity on July 16, 1945, offered a quicker and more terrifying solution. To force Japan into unconditional surrender, that was bombing Japan with atomic bombs. Shortly after, from July 17 to August 2nd, representatives from the Allies, Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom held the Potsdam Conference to discuss critical wartime issues, including the swift defeat of the Japanese Empire and ending the war. On July 26th, the UK, US, and Republic of China issued the Potsdam Declaration to Japan, serving as an ultimatum demanding immediate, unconditional surrender. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. Japan received the declaration on July 26th, and there were varying reactions among the leadership. While the Japanese government had no specific response, the militarist faction considered the declaration outrageous and urged immediate rejection. On the afternoon of July 28th, during a press conference, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki declined to comment on the report, and Japan continued the war. With that decision, the United States resolved to use atomic bombs to end the war as soon as possible. The developments in the Pacific Front and the Japanese government's response to the Potsdam Declaration led to the US decision to use atomic bombs to end the war. But the question remained, where would the United States use this weapon of mass destruction on Japanese territory? In the spring of 1945, the US military convened a committee of officers and scientists to determine which location should be targeted with the atomic bomb. The committee identified two objectives for the atomic bombing. The first was to intimidate the Japanese into unconditional surrender and to impress the world with the power of this new weapon. Historian Alex Wellerstein stated that at the time, the US was still considering questions such as whether the target should be a city, a military base, or simply a demonstration without casualties. Physicist Edward Teller believed the only hope was for people to witness the consequences of what had been created, which might persuade them that the next war would be catastrophic. For this purpose, using the atomic bomb in actual combat could be the best option. So around May 1945, the Target Selection Committee proposed several cities as bombing targets, including Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. The committee rejected limiting the use of the bomb to military targets due to the risk of missing small objectives within residential areas. The psychological impact on Japan was crucial for the committee. They also agreed that the first use of the atomic bomb required thorough preparation due to its international significance. Kyoto was chosen because it was Japan's former capital and a cultural center, while Hiroshima was a large city and military logistics base. Tokyo was excluded, since it had already suffered extensive damage in the March 9th napalm bombing. After much debate, Kyoto was removed from the list due to its cultural importance and fears of public backlash over destroying a historical site. The target shifted to Hiroshima with Kokura and Nagasaki as secondary targets. If Japan still refused to surrender at the time of the bombing, Hiroshima was significant both militarily and industrially. Several military camps nearby included the 5th Division headquarters and the 2nd General Army Command, led by Marshal Hata Shunroku in charge of southern Japan's defense. Hiroshima also served as a logistics-based communications hub and weapons assembly center for the Japanese army. Another reason for selecting Hiroshima was General Spaatzy's report stating there were no prisoner of war camps in the city. With all these factors, Washington decided it was the primary target. On the morning of August 6th, 3 B-29 superfortresses appeared over Hiroshima. 2 carried cameras and scientific equipment to record the impact. The third, named Enola Gay, was responsible for the bombing at 8 a.m. Hiroshima's radar station detected only 3 aircraft and cancelled the air raid alert at 8:15. Enola Gay opened its bomb bay, and less than a minute later, Hiroshima was engulfed in blinding light. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was named Little Boy and it exploded about 600 meters above ground with a blast equivalent to 13,000 tons of TNT. Around 9,000 people died instantly, and thousands more died later from radiation burns or trauma. The destruction radius was 1.6 kilometers, and fires spread over an area of 4.4 kilometers. An estimated 90% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed or damaged by December 1945. The death toll in Hiroshima had reached 14,000, and for more than 45 years afterward, hundreds continued to die. Each year from radiation exposure after the explosion, President Truman's staff in Washington issued a further warning that if the Japanese government did not surrender immediately, the United States declared that if they did not accept our terms now, they would have to endure a rain of ruin from the sky, the likes of which had never been seen on Earth. On August 8th, approximately 6 million leaflets were dropped from the air over 47 Japanese cities, with populations of over 100,000. The leaflets described an atomic bomb with destructive power equivalent to 2,000 B-29 bombers attacking simultaneously, and urged the Japanese people to petition the emperor to end the war. The Japanese government made no response to the Potsdam Declaration. The Emperor Hirohito, the government and the War Council were still considering 4 conditions for Japan's surrender: maintaining the imperial organization and national polity, entrusting the responsibility of disarmament to the imperial authorities not occupying Japan, and authorizing the Japanese government to punish war criminals. Earlier on August 5th, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had informed Tokyo of the termination of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, and just minutes after midnight on August 8th, Tokyo time, the Soviet Union launched a simultaneous ground armor and air assault on the Japanese Kwantung Army, stationed in Manchuria. 4 hours later at dawn on August 9th, Tokyo received the Soviet government's declaration of war. Because the Japanese government continued to refuse to surrender, the United States decided to drop a second bomb, this time targeting Nagasaki. Nagasaki had been the largest port city in southern Japan, with significant naval importance and a diverse industrial base producing ammunition ships, military equipment and other war-related materials. It was one of the few cities not yet subjected to large-scale bombing. On the morning of August 9th, the B-29 named Boxcar was tasked with the bombing similar to Hiroshima. The bomb was named Fat Man at 0750. Japanese time. An air raid alert sounded in Nagasaki, but was lifted at 0830 when only 2 B-29s were spotted. By 10:53, the Japanese assumed they were reconnaissance planes and did not issue another alert. At around 11:01, the Fat Man bomb was dropped over the city's industrial valley. 43 seconds later, it exploded at an altitude of 469 meters above ground. The explosion had a destructive force equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. At the time of the explosion, approximately 2,000 people were in the city. However, due to the bomb being dropped hastily, it detonated between the 2 main targets: the steel and weapons factory in the north and the torpedo factory in the south. Had it fallen slightly southward, the commercial and residential areas would have suffered far greater damage. This was a key reason why, despite having more explosive power than Little Boy in Hiroshima, Fat Man caused relatively less destruction nonetheless. An estimated 7,000 people died instantly, and tens of thousands more were injured. The blast radius was 1.6 kilometers. Fires extended from the northern part of the city to 3.2 kilometers south of the explosion. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed at least 16,000 people immediately. The number of those injured and who later died due to radiation is uncountable. The United States had even planned to use more bombs if the Japanese government still refused to surrender. However, the 2 tragedies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki caused Emperor Hirohito and many Japanese leaders to change their perspective. A few hours before the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the Japanese government's Supreme War Council met to consider whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration. The militarist representatives still strongly opposed, but on the evening of August 9th, after hearing the news about the Nagasaki disaster, the emperor convened the council again and urged them to accept the conditions as long as the imperial family and the line of succession were preserved. The Japanese government immediately conveyed this condition to the Americans. The next day, U.S. Secretary of State James Burns stated there should be no distinction between the emperor and other individuals, but Secretary of War Henry Stimson argued that only the emperor's authority could compel the Japanese armed forces to surrender, which would help the U.S. avoid future meaningless battles and give the Soviets less time to mobilize in the Pacific. In response to Japan, the U.S. emphasized that the Japanese would not be allowed to choose their form of government, but agreed to ensure the safety of the emperor and the royal family. Meanwhile, Japanese military leaders still refused to accept defeat, and debates dragged on for several days. Finally, on August 14th, the emperor announced he had decided to accept the Potsdam Declaration. He even declared he would record a speech to broadcast nationwide, an unprecedented act. However, anti-surrender factions firmly opposed this, and that night they plotted a coup to prevent the emperor's message from being delivered. Military leaders deceived and forced the 2nd Imperial Guard Regiment to join them, entered the Kai Palace and destroyed the recording containing the surrender announcement. The emperor, along with Marquis Kido and several ministers, hid, and the rebels could not find them. When loyalist forces arrived, the coup leader, Major Hatanaka, and others committed suicide. By noon on August 15th, Japanese radio stations simultaneously broadcast the emperor's message, calling on all forces to surrender. On August 17th, the surrender order was sent to Japanese troops still scattered across Japan and abroad. On the morning of August 28th, the first units of the U.S. 11th Airborne Division landed in Japan, beginning the American military occupation on behalf of the Allies. On the afternoon of August 30th, General Douglas MacArthur and his staff arrived and set up a temporary headquarters in Yokohama, later moving to Tokyo. On September 2, 1945, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, under the supervision of General MacArthur, Japanese officials including Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender, officially ending World War II. Although it played a major role in quickly and decisively ending the war and preventing further meaningless battles in the Pacific, the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains controversial. The main objections revolve around two key reasons. The bombings caused massive civilian casualties and were considered morally indefensible, and they were militarily unnecessary. From an ethical standpoint, many individuals and organizations condemned the bombings, with some labeling them as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Two notable figures were Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, who, despite having earlier signed a letter to President Roosevelt in 1939 encouraging atomic bomb research, later criticized their use. Han Gillat reasoned as follows: "Let me focus primarily on the moral issue. Suppose Germany had successfully developed 2 atomic bombs before us, and suppose Germany dropped those 2 bombs, for example on Rochester and Buffalo, which are 2 counties in the state of New York, USA, and then they lost the war. Would anyone hesitate to consider that a war crime and prosecute the Germans for that act at a New York court, and then hang them?" Many scientists involved in the Manhattan Project also opposed the use of the bomb in practice. 7 scientists, led by Dr. James Franck, submitted a report to the President's Interim Committee in May 1945, in which it was written that if the United States is the first to use this indiscriminate weapon, we will lose public support worldwide and provoke an arms race, while hindering the possibility of reaching an international agreement on the control of such weapons in the future. Professor Peter Kuznick, director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, also assessed President Truman's decision to authorize the atomic bomb as one where he knew he had initiated a process of annihilating life, that it was not just a war crime, but a crime against humanity. Kuznick also believed that one of the driving motives behind the US bombing was the desire to demonstrate the power of the new weapon to the Soviet Union. Historian Mark Selden of Cornell University also believed that impressing the Russians was more important than ending the war with Japan. Militarily, many believed, including high-ranking American generals, that using the atomic bomb was unnecessary because Japan was already preparing to surrender and conventional bombing raids were enough to exert pressure, General Eisenhower later wrote in his memoir that in 1945, Secretary of War Stimson visited my headquarters in Germany and informed me that our government was preparing to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. I was one of those who felt that there were sound reasons to doubt the wisdom of that action while he described the related events. I felt depressed and expressed my doubts to him. First, I believed Japan was already defeated and the use of the bomb was completely unnecessary. Second, I believed that the use of that weapon was not essential to save American lives because our nation should avoid shocking the world with such weapons. Other American generals shared Eisenhower's views, including General Dulles Mark W. Clark, the highest-ranking general in the Pacific Theater, Admiral William D. Leahy, the highest-ranking official in the President's Executive Office, General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, and Lieutenant General Carter Clark, a military intelligence officer, among others, Admiral William D. Leahy also stated that the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not materially assist in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender naturally alongside the opposing opinions. There was also a stream of thought supporting the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Supporters of the bombings argue that the two explosions ended the war months earlier, thereby saving hundreds of thousands of lives. They believe the Soviet attack on Manchuria could only drive Japan out of mainland Asia, but could not defeat Japan in its home islands. And as mentioned, if operations Olympic and Coronet had to be carried out, the Allies would have suffered an additional 1.2 million casualties, including at least 26 in 7,000 deaths. Proponents of the bombings also point out that waiting for Japan to surrender was not a costless option. The war was killing 2,000 civilians each month in Asia since February 1945 conventional. Bombings were killing over 100,000 people each month in Japan, and this would have continued until the US forces landed on the Japanese mainland. The atomic bombs quickly ended World War II in Asia, liberating millions in occupied territories and avoiding unnecessary battles and bloodshed. Thus, although many opposed and condemned the use of atomic bombs, their role in ending the Second World War cannot be completely denied. However, the consequences of the bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not end so quickly and persist to this day. Those affected by the two bombings are called hibakusha, and as of 2023, there are still hundreds of thousands of them in Japan, the memorials in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the victims of these bombings forever stand as a warning to humanity about the terrifying threat of nuclear weapons capable of destroying an entire civilization.